So when we're in fat burning mode, we require more oxygen, but we give off less CO2, less carbon dioxide.
Yes, comparatively less. So the CO2 that's created in our body is created, at least in part, with as a result of glycolysis, which is the way that we burn sugars.
Right.
So whenever we're burning fats, we're sparing our sugars. That's called glycogen sparing. Whenever we're burning fat, we are producing comparatively less carbon dioxide, because it's the ratio that we're looking into means that we're able to take in more oxygen, burn more fat, and there's not as much of a need to burn the carbohydrates, and produce that carbon dioxide.
Today, I'm joined with our sports physiologist at the Institute, Jeff Cournoyer. Jeff, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm excited about this.
So the first question I have is, what is sports physiology? Just pencils and crayons for me, if you would.
So when I get asked that question all the time, even by my own mom, and one of the ways that I describe it is, if you've ever seen a Nike commercial where, the guy's got all the wires hanging off of him and he's running up on the treadmill, he's got a mask on his face, and you got a bunch of computers and a bunch of scientists around them. Those are exercise physiologists. So what we do is we have we try to study the way that all the systems in the body react before, during, and after exercise. How does your heart react? How do your lungs react? How does your metabolism react? All those sorts of things, so that we can see, what exercise actually does to you. And if we need to change anything, we can learn from those tests how we change it.
So that's a great explanation. And I'm going to have that visual in my head, but I see that visual in our clinic too. And so in sports physiology, your background, you came from working in some professional athlete settings, teams like the Patriots, go Pats, the Miami Dolphins. I'm just saying, but I may or may not be a fan. Miami Dolphins. You were at University of Miami. Is there an important piece of looking at I'm going to use the word ideal body, an elite body does with I call it a hormetic event, or the event of exercise. Does that give you a knowledge of kind of what the elite species does under that stressor of exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was working within the NFL and at the University of Miami, my initial education was in athletic training or sports medicine. So it was in that vein that I was working with those patients, and with that, not patients, the athletes. And with that kind of experience, one of the things that I would notice all the time is something about overtraining. Right. I mean, even the most elite individuals that you can work with, Division I athletes, or I was born and raised in Massachusetts, so my favorite team as well, the New England Patriots. But, working with those athletes, you can see how hard it is for them to get to a peak physical condition, but then just how quickly they can almost go over that precipice and begin to kind of decline because they've trained too hard. Whether it is overuse injuries, with your joints, or just physiologically with doing, too much and kind of declining in that sense. Either way, it's definitely very interesting to see what peak physical condition is, and how if you go too much of anything is not a good thing, right? So you can kind of go too far in the other direction as well.
And we always look at that in my previous clinical practice. I've been practicing for 30 years in the wellness space. And we always looked at that point of inflection, and we would say, okay, what are we infusing the body with from a nutrition perspective, from a nutrient perspective, from, chiropractic or physical therapy or acupuncture or the hydration or maintaining the pH, all of those things. What are we infusing it, and how can we move that inflection point? That is, I felt like working with individuals, in the NFL and the NBA and all of that, I learned so much about those bodies that I was able to bring back to an individual in a diseased state. Do you use some of those learnings in correlation with people that are dealing with chronic illness?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that it was a crazy aha moment for me, probably about, I don't know, maybe 6 to 9 months after starting to work with like the chronic illness populations, how very similar the display is of something like a chronic fatigue crash versus, what
Right.
overtraining syndrome looks like. There's
Right.
so many overlying symptoms between the two.
I was in shock. I love that you say that. We have a common experience. I just got chills because it was shocking to me too. And a lot of my space was more originally in the autoimmune space, coming from the patient population, the client population that was, professional athlete into kind of the autoimmune space. And I learned so much about the similarities and also the value of looking at the metabolic processes that happen in the body and when they happen. What is the evoked stressor? I'm gonna back up 2 seconds. Say, how did you land at Institute at INM? We call it INM, guys, Institute for Neuroimmune Medicine. INM.
Yeah,
From now on, we're calling it IM. The rest of this conversation. How did you land at INM?
Well, yeah, I will say that it's definitely a mouthful to say Institute for Neuroimmune Medicine, and I typically stutter with that. So I'm glad I just got it out all the way there too.
You did good.
But so I was working at the University of Miami in their physical therapy department for years at this point. When I met a woman, we were doing some exercise testing at UM, and I met a woman who at the time was the director of clinical research here at INM. Her name is Elizabeth Balbin.
Yes.
And she no longer works with us here, but she was the one who kind of brought me over, introduced me to Dr. Klimas. And yeah, that was back in 2015. And I just saw, it was a very different patient population from what I was working with, of course. But, I just saw just this incredible, just the way that this whole institute kind of works and how interdisciplinary it is and all that kind of stuff. It was fascinating to me. And yeah, I was excited to kind of come on board at that point.
One of the things in chronic illness, and definitely with ME, CFS, or long COVID, is that post-exertional malaise. And sometimes the exertion can be attending a wedding. It can be, going grocery shopping, but we also see this in exercise. And I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about, like a 2-day cardiovascular study or a 2-day cardio study, where they were showing that our patient population or patient populations like ours are not typically getting better day 2, they're actually crashing day 2. How do you define when we're looking, I want to ask about all of I see you with the masks and the wires and all of that. I want to know exactly why you're doing that. But how do you redefine exercise in a person that's looking to heal or rebalance in a disease state?
So I love that question. That's one of the first things that I always do with my patients is, when they come on in, I like to ask them a bunch about what it is they do on a daily basis. I ask them to kind of walk me through what their exercise or what their activity looks like. And I think one of the biggest things I like to do is I hesitate to use the word exercise very much, because it already has a connotation to it. It has the dripping in sweat. Whenever I do it in presentations, I have a slide with Jordan Peele from Key and Peele, where he's just like dripping profusely in sweat. I always think that episode's funny, but like that's the thought process that we always have with exercise. And what I do is I try to talk about it more so in a sense of exertion. So we have physical exertion, but we also have mental exertion, emotional exertion, and a new one that I've been discussing a lot with my patients recently is sensory exertion. Right. So, I mean, simply just going to a cheerleading competition for your daughter and, having it be just so loud, and the music and the vibration of the seats, that sort of sensory exertion in and of itself is, of course, exertion. And it can kind of count to the body as exercise.
And it's amazing because I love that you brought that up, because a lot of times people will say, I'm fatigued, I'm exhausted, I don't feel well. It's not like I just ran a 5K or a 10K or even more, the Boston Marathon. We had Patriots Day last Monday, right? But it's actually measurable that the body in stress will exhibit the same metabolic changes with, like you said, sensory stimulus or overstimulus for that body, the same metabolic changes as if they did run a 5K. It's measurable. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, when I do when I do my testing, again, getting back to like the mask and everything, one of the powers of the machine that's attached to that mask is that it has the capability to decipher what type of metabolism your body is using at any given time. So for somebody without CFS, whether they're a high trained athlete or even just a couch potato, for the most part, the people will begin to prioritize fat metabolism as a main fuel source. And that's exactly what we want when we put them through
during
during
exercise,
or even just at rest.
Okay.
So
Okay. So
even just like us sitting here right now, hopefully both of us are just burning 90 to 95% fat as our main way of generating energy.
What do they say? Your
Fingers
lips
crossed.
to God's ears. Yeah, your lips to God's ears. Let's do it. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the goal.
So that's the goal. But what we see a lot of times is, patients with CFS, if I knew the answer to the ultimate question in this sense, I'd be a much richer man than I am. But, what we do see a lot of times is that the body begins to prioritize carbohydrates either at rest or even just much sooner throughout an exercise test. So what I tell people a lot of times is that even though it's through no fault of theirs, when they do it, when they're just kind of sitting there, it feels as though their body is sprinting. Like you said, running a 5K or whatever the case is, they're sprinting when they're just sitting still.
Right.
And of course that, imagine just, we'll be on this call for what, a half hour, 45 minutes, whatever it is. Imagine sprinting for 30, 45 minutes at a time. Anybody's going to be exhausted at that. And it's just physiologically speaking, it's the same. It's very simple.
And from what I understand too, at that point, they're kind of taking their glycogen storage, right? So they're breaking down muscle even while so they can have some of that muscle wasting, not muscle building, as if they were doing as if metabolically they were in an aerobic experience, right? So they'll have also muscle fatigue and weakness because they're burning those sugar storage in the smooth muscle and in the liver. I mean, that's just fascinating to me. They're not going into that beta oxidation. They're not burning fat, right? In those exhausted states. I'm going to take this because I'm excited about this. Talk to me about some of the technology that we use and what it is and why it's important.
So the biggest piece of technology that we use is something called a metabolic cart.
Okay.
And a metabolic cart, we have had a few different generations of them in the roughly decade that I've worked with Einem, leading all the way back to we had one that ran on Windows XP.
Oh my goodness!
And when I called, when we finally had some issues with the computer, I called. We need to do an operating system reboot, and they asked if I had a floppy drive. And yes, the computer on the front had a floppy drive. So they laughed at me and said, "Get something new."
So this interfaces with a computer?
Yes.
And it measures what? There's a mask that goes on the face.
So there's a mask that goes on the face, and then there's a couple of tubes that come off of the mask. One of those tubes measures just the total amount of air, just the flow that comes in and out of your body in any given minute. That's what we call ventilation. And our minute ventilation is just really it's a great way to kind of assess how well and how strongly our lungs are working in any given minute. So of course, we wouldn't expect to see very much ventilation when we're just sitting here, just having a calm conversation. But as you get toward the end of a VO2 max test, which is the intense exercise test, again, that you might see in a Nike commercial.
It's called a VO2 max.
VO2 max test. Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just called like a maximal exertion test.
Okay. Because I know my question is going to be, when do we ask for this to be done in our bodies, and how do we ask for this to be done? So I'm making sure. So VO2 max test and a maximal, what was that?
Maximal exertion.
Maximal exertion test. Okay. But please keep telling me, and then I'm saving my question.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we get somebody, kind of going through and doing one of these tests, one of those wires, again, kind of does ventilation. The other one, it's called a Nafian tube, and honestly it fascinates me. I don't even really know fully how it works, but there's a way that with the material that it's made of, it can separate oxygen and carbon dioxide and be able to transmit both of those back to sensors that sit within our metabolic carts. And that oxygen sensor can tell us everything we need to know about how our body is able to metabolize our food sources, and how hard it works, how well it's able to deliver oxygen to the working muscles. I did see on one of the previous podcasts that you did that you guys were talking about mitochondrial function.
Yes.
And metabolism within the mitochondria requires oxygen to be present. So when we talk about oxygen delivery to the mitochondria, that's, kind of the key that unlocks the rest of the metabolism. So it's really important to be able to understand how that oxygen, how that the dynamics of that oxygen work throughout the body, and how it kind of comes into our computer. So we can
Right. And it's also responsible for nutrient delivery. Like, so sometimes, I'm a big supplement fan personally. It saved my life, in my opinion. Right. And so, but if our oxygen ratios are off, it can inhibit effective nutrient delivery, right? In the blood cells, it can inhibit bone density. It can inhibit hair growth. I mean, we are an oxygen dependent being, and the CO2, the carbon dioxide, are we looking for certain ratios in a healthy metabolism?
Yes. So there's actually a respiratory exchange ratio. That's one of the things that we look at. So the RER, or the respiratory quotient, those are not necessarily synonymous, but for this particular conversation, we can say that they're roughly the same thing, is essentially just the ratio of the amount of carbon dioxide that we breathe out over the amount of oxygen that we breathe in with any given breath. When we are burning fats as a primary fuel source, we require much more oxygen, and we produce comparatively less carbon dioxide.
Okay, I want you to say that again. That's massive. So when we're in fat burning mode, we require more oxygen, but we give off less CO2, less carbon dioxide.
Yes, comparatively less. So the CO2 that's created in our body is created, at least in part, with as a result of glycolysis, which is the way that we burn sugars.
Right.
So whenever we're burning fats, we're sparing our sugars. That's called glycogen sparing. Whenever we're burning fat, we are producing comparatively less carbon dioxide, because it's the ratio that we're looking into means that we're able to take in more oxygen, burn more fat, and there's not as much of a need to burn the carbohydrates, and produce that carbon dioxide. And
so we have more ATP, or more cellular energy too, correct?
Yes, and that's kind of the big deal when we look at it's a crazy statistic. When we look at the amount of ATP, which by the way stands for adenosine triphosphate, it's kind of the my professors always used to call it like the energy currency of the cell. So when we to move, to be able to do anything we want to do in life, we need to spend ATP. We need to generate that.
Yes.
And when we generate that using fat, for every molecule of fat that we burn, we generate at least 129 molecules of ATP.
So that's what I was just going to ask you. Can you compare that to carb?
So when you're burning carbs, if you're doing fully anaerobic glycolysis, you go from 129 to 2. Got it. So it's, what I always talk about is like the efficiency of these different fuel sources, and how driving I always compare it to like driving a Prius versus driving a Ferrari, right? A Prius, you might not win any road races, but you're going to be very fuel efficient. You're probably not going to have to refuel until you get out of the state of Florida. I live in Miami, by the way, so that's pretty far distance. But if you when you're using carbohydrates, like you're driving that Ferrari, you're going to be able to win a lot of those drag races, those road races, but you'll probably have to refuel after every single one of them. Right. So there are times to use both, but it's it's definitely a very different energy source in terms of its efficiency.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to take you back into what we're seeing in our clinic when people have either viral reactivation, viral based chronic illness, toxicity, mycotoxin, the body's homeostasis goes off. The body's in that neuroinflammatory response, right? The body's neurological response, the immune system's response starts to not regulate properly. How do we see that in the physiology or the movement? I don't want to even say exercise physiology, but the movement of the human body and the oxygen exchange and the energy exchange.
So it's a really good question. And, as far as I know, we don't have a completely definite idea of that just yet. But one of the theories that I kind of operate under, and this is something that I know that Dr. Klimas has spoken about, and our whole institute talks about a lot, is of course with these viral reactivations, one of the things that also starts to go up a lot is the immune system, and it becomes
Right.
kind of hyperactive and almost hyperreactive. And when we get into those states, whenever our immune system is kind of in this, in this hyperreactive zone, it sends our body into a fight or flight.
Right. So the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system gets driven more. Okay.
Right. It gets driven. And whenever you're driving the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flights, it utilizes the energy that it can get as quickly as possible. And it kind of forgets about the efficiency of it. If you're in fight or flight, if you're running away from a bear, it doesn't matter what energy source you're using. You just need to get away from the bear. And that's kind of what happens when our bodies come into this fight or flight system, and it begins to throw off the metabolic statuses that we see, and that happens in so many of our patients.
And on the other end of that, what we're seeing too, it seems, is that we have the fight and flight, the sympathetic nervous system, but then we have the rest and digest. So we get a lot of GI issues, food allergies, food intolerances, bloating, tummy sensitivities, things like that, because we're in that drive mode constantly. That the other part of the nervous system, also the lack of sleep, right? Or the inability to achieve, not that somebody wants to not sleep, but truly the inability to achieve deep REM, that deep restorative sleep where the nervous system resets itself, the lymphatic, system of the brain. I was talking to Harris about that the other day. It's like sleep, sleep, sleep. So when should someone have a VO2 max test done? I mean, all my athletes do it, right? Right. But on the other end of that spectrum, what benefit does having this run? Like, what does it tell us? What's the aha moment? And how do we alter care or therapies based on the data that we get?
So one big caveat that I want to make to that is that for most of our patients, a VO2 max test isn't necessarily a requirement. But what we can do instead is we can do what we call a submaximal test. So rather than having them go as hard as they possibly can, when we do a submaximal test, we push them just enough to where we can see that metabolic change actually occur. Right?
We're looking at that, and that changes the oxygen to CO2 ratio?
Yes. When that ratio changes, we can also see that on our computers, we're outputted a very important graph called indirect calorimetry. And that is the graph that actually shows us how much energy we're using in fats, how much we're using in carbohydrates, and how those dynamics sort of change and how they would change over time. So we can kind of see how long somebody might be able to perform a given activity, how intense that activity can be, and so on and so forth, until that fat metabolism kind of falls off the map. And then at that point, for the purposes of our clinical experiences, there's really not a significant amount of extra value to going all the way to a VO2 max test.
Got it.
Unless we're doing like disability testing, things like that, but that's kind of a different conversation. But when we do just a submaximal test, we can still see all of this great metabolic information, and we can also see how the heart rate or how the heart itself reacts to these things. I don't necessarily use heart rate as a main limiter. I don't really like to tell my patients that, as long as you stay below 106 beats per minute, so keep it on your watch. As long as you stay below 106 beats per minute, you'll be fine. I don't really like to use that because I think there's a lot of different dynamics there. But what we can see is how the heart rate reacts to exercise. If there is, again, more of a fight or flight response to it, if it's a blunted response without the use of medications, that also gives us a lot of context about how the heart is kind of perceiving, how the nervous system is perceiving this exercise.
I love that. And it's, I'm jumping into the research end of things in right now in my journey, my own journey. And so I feel like all I'm doing is like thinking and pondering. And, we're fortunate at the Institute because we all spend at the very least every Friday together, right? Talking about cases and discussing new ideas and new opportunities. I was reading, and some of it was Dr. Ray, and some of it was a lot of the work that you do, was they were talking about when the body becomes in a toxic state, and that's either with environmental toxins, molds, funguses, mycotoxins, heavy metals, that oftentimes the body will inhibit going into fat burning because those are fat soluble toxins that are stored in adipocytes. And I was like, we just like, everybody's having this conversation on a Friday and it's just kind of going through it. I'm going, oh my gosh, I want Jeff to run every single person I've ever seen in my entire community because I want to know what their CO2, oxygen CO2 ratios are. And again, I know, we incorporate therapies to help re-regulate the nervous system so that we're not in that sympathetic drive. And we use therapies to help relieve the toxic body response and balance the immune response. But that data point, I think, in the work that you do is so important because there's so many variables that we can then go back and talk about how do we nourish a person before exercise? How do we feed a person that's under stress? How do we chelate a person that's under stress? How do we rebalance the immune system? It's just such incredible data. Tell me, like, your dream situation. There's no money issue. There's no time issue. What patients, what population could benefit from having this kind of physiology, this kind of exploration of their physiology? What could happen there?
Oh my God, I can't think of an example of a patient or an individual that wouldn't benefit from this. It's at whatever time point in your life or in your journey, whether it's for weight loss or kind of attempting to get back in shape. And I in shape, you got to use the quotation marks because there's really not a scientific definition for that term.
But feeling resilient, having an abundance of energy, feeling strong. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Swinging from the chandeliers. That's what I want for all my clients. Yeah. Resiliency and immune. Yeah. Let's do it.
Yes.
Agreed.
Exactly. So whoever you are, whatever point you are, if you have CFS, if you don't have CFS, if you're a professional athlete who is looking to kind of improve their skills or their running time or whatever the case is, I do think that being able to analyze how your body is reacting to the exercise, being able to get a baseline and then say, okay, in 6 months, we're going to retest this. And if we've worked together in the correct way, there's a really good chance that we're going to see a swing of some of these data points. And in that process,
Sorry. How often do you like to retest it? How often do you like to retest it?
When it comes to, somebody without CFS, I would probably say about every 6 months.
Got it.
We do see that, especially because of, the extra caution that we exercise with CFS patients. I usually would say more about like 9 to 12 months for a CFS patient because we're working a little bit more gradually.
Got it.
But, so the good news is when it comes to this sort of exercise test, it's, relatively low risk because we start off with, at the lowest possible intensity that we can. And provided that you are able to perform at that level of intensity, we can get a good idea. And you might only be on the bike for 30 seconds. You could be on the bike for 30 minutes. Like there's a large separation between every person that I could work with in this sense. So
and everybody's body is, I love everybody's body is so different. And that data that you give us allows us to create a therapy in our institute that's body specific. So how can someone out there ask for this testing to be done? Is it normal in clinics? Is it in only specialty clinics? Like, where do we see this in physical therapy?
So right now it's mostly just kind of specialty clinics. We were kind of looking around and we are starting to see it a little bit more as a, it's kind of like a boutique sort of medicine sort of situation. So, I mean, there's different like metabolic clinics that you can go to, or, things that you can kind of like hack your metabolism and stuff like that. But mostly the place that you find this the most is at universities. Most universities have an exercise science department where they have some sort of metabolic analyzer. And that's going to kind of be able to help out with that. it is, unfortunately a little bit rare at the moment. And, you kind of asked about, swinging for the fences and shooting for the stars. Yeah, I would love for this sort of science to be as prevalent in everyday society as something like personal training is, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
like
I'm
when you
with
could
you.
get a test to do that first, it would just be amazing. So making this much more popular of a science would be lovely.
And I am so glad that you said that, because one of the things that I do is I get, so like, again, when you work with those extreme athlete situations, and I work more in the nutrition and natural health aspect with them, but lifestyle modification, you learn so much about how you can get performance out of a body by changing, like you said, fat metabolism. When they burn fat, they get 129, units of ATP versus 2 units of ATP, right? You learn how to oxygenate or saturate oxygen for duration of exercise. That same principle, we've got to make sure that the doctors and the physicians are understanding that that same nuanced medicine has to be applied to a body under duress or stress, and especially a body with chronic fatigue. So you jumped right into what I was going to say. If you're out there and you've been diagnosed with ME/CFS, long COVID, there's many other POTS, many other syndromes that would fall into this category. Tap into a university exercise science department. That's what we usually have our clients do. We usually get a referral back into the universities and find people like you, and then bring that data to your physician. But also it's validating, because, and I love what you said, Jeff, about the sensory stimulus too. You can feel physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, by having light stimulus or sound stimulus or vibration stimulus. And so honor and trust your body, and find practitioners that will believe your truth and advocate for your truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, it really just is so important. I mean, one of the words that you used already in this conversation is resiliency. And I say that to my patients so much, I think sometimes they roll their eyes at me a little bit. But the idea of resiliency, the idea of training your body to be resilient of these things. I mean, if you or I go to a mall, in the Christmas rush, right, and we try to, get in, get out, there's so many people and there's so much going on and so much loud music and stimulus and people running around and everything. It's exhausting. It absolutely is. And that's somebody that, has that kind of physiological resiliency. Unfortunately, with something like CFS, that sometimes gets a little interrupted.
It does. And also discredited and discounted. And
absolutely.
I was fortunate enough to go through the testing that you've described to our community today. And I will tell you why I went through it. I went through it because, having an autoimmune disorder, I found myself what I call living with fear of the flare, right? Which is, just when is the other shoe going to drop? I was fortunate. I was able to get off prednisone, Celsep, Imurin, Mepron, use natural therapies. I have a very vibrant health, but I lived with fear of the flare because I didn't have data to know how far I could push myself, or when I really needed to back up and nurture myself. And that's what I love. That's why, when I came to the Institute, I didn't know you were there. I was so excited when I found out that you were there, because it was such a tool to give me permission. I don't even want to say permission, but like communication with my own body, knowledge to know how to feed myself, how to nourish myself, how to nourish myself and nurture myself, and rest, when to rest, how to pace myself. So it's a phenomenal tool. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking to our community about it. I would love to have you back. I would like to go deeper into some of the metabolic pathways if you're open to that.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. I just want to give everybody, this is new for a lot of people. It was new for me when I first was looking at how to build my own resilience, and really how to start to have confidence in when to say no and when to say yes, and how to pace myself and how to pre-rest and do all of those things. It feels like lab work for me. When I take my labs and my platelets are good, I go, okay, I'm doing a good job. When we have this kind of testing, we can see where the body and don't and just know that you deserve to have just as good of care for your on the field performance of life, whether it's being a mom or a CEO or whatever, a firefighter or a nurse. That same point of inflection identification that we use in the NFL and for professional athletes, we want that point of identification inflection so we know how to infuse you on your journey to getting wellness.
Yeah. And I just got to tell you, I wrote down, I just had to write down that phrase, the on the field performance of life. Right. I love that phrase so much. It is, it really does, everything that we do is exercise in one way or another. This conversation that we've had today, it's exercise to the body. Right. And when we can kind of break down the nuance of that and kind of redefine this really, frankly, ambiguous term, if we can kind of redefine this term and understand that everything we do in our body is exercise, it's exertion in one way or another, we can then start to tease out, what the best exercise to do for us might be. And again, as you said, increase this on the field performance of life. I love that phrase.
Absolutely. And be kind to yourself, because if it's not burning fat, it's not burning fat for a reason, right? It's not just that you're lazy or you're eating the wrong thing. Your body is super smart. And when we listen to it and we do, what I call complex diagnostics and complex care for a complex disorders, we have to marry those together. That's when we can get people on track. So Jeff, thank you so much for being here. It is just a pleasure to get to work with you. I feel very honored to have a place in the Institute myself, and it's very exciting work that you're doing. And I'm really excited for our community to start learning about it.
Absolutely. And thank you. I mean, the same goes for you. Everything that you've been doing and, getting this information out to the communities is, second to none. So, thank you for everything you're doing too. It's been so wonderful to be on here. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it. We'll talk again soon. I promise you guys I'm getting them back. All right.
Absolutely.
Bye, guys.